So this is a little video to introduce the second modules. Having talked so far about the nature of worldviews and looked at the history of worldviews, I now want to really set an agenda for exploring alternatives or ways away from that towards what we might broadly call a participatory worldview. That's got all sorts of issues and problems to it, but let's call it that for a start. So I've asked you to look at three papers. The first one is Living as Part of the Whole, which is a paper I wrote. And my ambition there was, in choosing this for us, is to really set an agenda for what we're going to look at in the future. And I talk about there the different aspects of the participatory world as I was seeing them at that time. It's a fairly straightforward paper. I don't want to go through it, but I thought it might be fun just to pick up a quote for each of those dimensions that I picked on. So for method, participation as method, which I start off with, I give you the old quote that John Rowan and I coined: we do research with people, not on people. Or I give you Mari-Liisa Swantz, my Finnish colleague who worked extensively in Africa. She says, I do not separate my scientific inquiry from my life. For me, it's really a quest for life, to understand life and to create what I call living knowledge, knowledge that is value for the people with whom I work and for myself. So if we move on to democracy, there's another quote, which is actually in the other paper I've given you, from Robin McTaggart. The aim of participatory research is to change practices, social structures, and social media which maintain irrationality, injustice, and unsatisfying forms of existence. Or if we want to think more ecologically, we could go just to Aldo Leopold, the great American writer, who says that humans have got to get used to the fact that we're plain members of the biotic community. The next heading is education, participation as education, and we'll come to Paulo Freire, who contrasts the banking versus education as the practice of freedom. And I found this rather nice quote from him. The teacher is, of course, an artist, but being an artist doesn't mean that he or she can make the profile, can shape the students. What the educator becomes in teaching is to make possible for the students to become themselves. And just to say on education and the whole notion of action research, we designed our Masters in Responsibility at the University of Bath entirely using an action research model. The whole thing was designed as cycles of action and reflection, in which there were some themes that we introduced, but each student was expected to make their own way through that course. The next heading suggests that we live in a participative world, and there's a lovely quote I saw from Martin Luther King. It's a quote that's been chosen or found by Drew Dellinger, the California poet I'm sure many of you know of. Martin Luther King said, "We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality." And Drew Dellinger is arguing that actually King is speaking there before the beginning of the ecological movement. And isn't it interesting that he is really speaking as a systems and a deep ecologist in saying that we humans are part of the interrelated structure of all reality. The next heading is participation in knowing and acting, and the obvious quote here is from Karl Marx: the point is not to understand the world, but to change it. And John Heron wrote a nice paper, I thought, where he argued that in action research, the primacy is with the practical. It's the primacy, the the justification for, the warrant for our claims to good research is that we can do things differently, we can do things better by some standard. Not that we know more, but that we can do more. Around the idea of ecology, I want to give you a quote from Gregory Bateson, who you must by now have gathered is one of my great heroes. And in Steps to an Ecology of Mind, my copy is page 462. It's quite a long quote, but I'll read it to you. If you put God outside and set him vis-a-vis his creation, and if you have the idea that you are created in his image, you will logically and naturally see yourselves as outside and against the things around you. And as you arrogate all mind to yourself, you'll see the world around you as mindless and therefore not entitled to moral and ethical consideration. So he's arguing later on the page, there's more to it, but I won't read it all. The most important, therefore, most important task today is perhaps to learn to think in the new way. And the new way is his version of being part of a participatory whole, part of mind. Then I talk about participation as beauty and aesthetics. And Thomas Berry, the great geologian, the great Catholic priest who has written so many important things about the new story of who humans are on the earth, he says that the universe by definition is a single gorgeous celebratory event. We come into being in and through the earth. Simply put, we're earthlings. The earth is our nourishment, our educator, our healer, our fulfillment. So we are part of it all. And later in the semester, we will come, towards the end, we'll come to exploring and seeing how the aesthetic dimension of knowing is so important. And finally, there's spirit. That one of those difficult words I keep calling other people on. So I quote Gary Snyder. Gary Snyder says that the sacred spirit, maybe the same, maybe different, but he says the sacred is that which takes you out of your little self into the wider whole. And for me, that wider whole is the cosmos. It doesn't need anything outside it, but for other people, there is some transcendental deity, which is, I can't see that, it's the same kind of argument. It takes you out of your little self into whatever you think of as being the wider whole. So we're certainly going to look at power. We're certainly going to look at ecological worldview. We're going to look at knowing and acting. We're going to look at beauty. We're going to look at a whole range of things that in some ways are formed by that list. Okay. So the second paper that I've asked you to read really is getting into the question of method, the first of those headings, just to show you the sorts of an approach or a way of thinking about participatory methods of inquiry. And the first paper is the introduction to the Handbook of Action Research, the first person, where Hilary and I wrote about inquiry and participation in search of a world worthy of human aspiration. And in that chapter, you'll find 5 dimensions of action research, which I think are pretty well set out. So I'm not going to go through them in detail right now. The other thing which I have added to the reading list, which you don't necessarily have to get into, but it's there if you want to, is the introduction to the second handbook, where we talked about one way of distinguishing between different approaches to action research, between first, second, and third person inquiry. First person meaning research for myself, research which is looking at my own action in the world, my own understanding of my action in the world. Second person research meaning research with other people in a direct face-to-face small group third person action research being about how we can increase that to consider research in a wider world, a more impersonal world, a world of organizations and societies and stuff like that. And that is discussed in the introduction to the second handbook. I'm going to stop this and start another video in a moment, so